Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very empowering show coming right up with special guest, Mary Mueller Shutan, and she's here today to share with us her new book, Working with Kundalini, an experimental guide to the process of awakening. Now, Mary is a spiritual healer and teacher with an extensive background in Chinese medicine, CranioSacral therapy, zero balancing, and energy work. She's authored many books on the topic of awakening, including The Spiritual Awakening Guide, Managing Psychic Abilities, The Body Deva, and of course, Working with Kundalini. So let's welcome to the show, Mary Mueller Shutan.
Thank you for having me.
What a pleasure it is to have you here and to talk about this book. I think a lot of times when we hear about Kundalini, people get a little confused about what that's all about.
Yeah, they very much do. And it's a problem with kind of words coming into our culture is that they really change and shift to meet the culture. And there tends to be a lot of confusion. But even in kind of the original culture, when we're talking about words like Kundalini, we're pointing at these really large spiritual concepts. So it isn't just one thing, one dictionary definition we can necessarily go to. So the confusion is understandable.
And so for people who are new to this work, what is Kundalini?
There are a lot of ways that we can discuss Kundalini. It really is consciousness or conscious awareness. But kind of better words to sort of hang your hat on would be things like creation energy, evolutionary energy, or spiritual power.
So when we look at Kundalini, what would be the purpose of awakening that?
The purpose of awakening Kundalini is to become more conscious. And so if somebody is going through a Kundalini awakening that's spontaneous, or maybe they've worked with specifically wanting to awaken their Kundalini, the purpose is for them to awaken consciousness within themselves and to go from basically being a human, who is concerned with particular things in their life to having more spiritual concerns, more spiritual inquiry, kind of a greater perspective of their lives, that sort of thing.
Okay, so if someone says, well, I've had a Kundalini awakening, what does that kind of look like?
So people can have different experiences of Kundalini, and they can go from having a momentary experience with the energy to a permanent state of realization where Kundalini is continually sort of unfolding or opening them up. And so when somebody is saying that they're having a Kundalini awakening, it's a process that happens where this energy that's located in the lower part of the body, so it's held within the sacrum or kind of the first, second chakra area, that potential opens up and energy starts flowing up the midline. And so when people are having a Kundalini awakening, what they're describing is typically experiencing a huge amount of energy going through their midline that changes their consciousness, their thoughts, their beliefs, as well as it's a healing or what's called a purification process in which what is blocking us from becoming more conscious, more realized, kind of comes up into awareness so we can heal it and resolve it.
So when you talked a little bit, and I know in your book you mentioned like some of the symptoms, like if someone's new and they're experiencing a Kundalini awakening, what would that feel like for them?
There are some symptoms that really point out that somebody is having a Kundalini awakening. The first is feeling a massive amount of energy come from the lower chakras or, the genital area or the low back going up through the midline, so through kind of like the spinal cord, through the area up to the head. Other people experience typically a large amount of fire or heat. That's part of kind of the purification that I was talking about. And people will experience things like shaking or going into spontaneous yoga postures or having spontaneous, their hands or feet go into movements. There often is a lot of digestive problems that happen. And there's a lot of what I call processing. And so processing is what happens is in that purification process, when we talk about what is blocking realization or us becoming conscious, it's typically trauma. And so that trauma sort of comes up to the surface so we can work through it and heal it and kind of move beyond the sort of limitations that have been imposed upon us through trauma. However, I am very careful about saying is that because there are a lot of things that can sort of mimic Kundalini awakening, is that really what we should look for are changes in perspective and sort of way of being over time, and not necessarily the symptoms, because somebody going through a Kundalini awakening is going to think much differently about the world and about themselves and relate to the world differently than they once did kind of before their Kundalini awakening.
Well, and it seems from your book that the different symptoms that present themselves can be so, different from one person to another, that this is kind of just a guideline of what to expect.
It is. The book very much goes over, because you can have one person have a Kundalini awakening, and it's not like they won't have some difficulties with the process, but maybe they have prepared their system. Maybe they've done yoga or qigong or something for a long period of time. Maybe they've done a lot of spiritual and energetic work or psychotherapy or something where they really understand themselves already on a deep level. And so the experience of this energy is going to be much different than somebody who it might kind of emerge in spontaneously, who fights against it, who has no idea what's going on, who has no framework, who doesn't think that spiritual experiences are a thing or that it makes them crazy or something. So it really very much varies on who the person is and kind of where they are as to their experience of it.
Well, I think your book is a great resource for people who are going through this, and kind of deciding, gosh, what's happening? It can help them kind of work through that, because a lot of times when someone does have an awakening, you almost feel like you need a padded room sometimes because you've got all these different experiences and you're like, what is going on?
Yeah, and so my first book was called The Spiritual Awakening Guide, and that goes over all of the different kinds of spiritual awakenings somebody could have. And this book is particular for Kundalini awakenings, and there really is a real need in our culture to say, hey, look, this is happening. This is what other people have experienced of it through the ages. This is the purpose of what's going on. This is the result, what you can look for. This is other people's experiences of it. And once people have that information, they typically look at, and some tools to help navigate the process, which all my books go into, is that they typically look at the process much differently than they once did, and they're less likely to kind of need that, padded room.
Yeah. Well, and so when we look at, you mentioned that Kundalini awakening is something that's happening right now. What are the implications, just as a society, for this taking place at this present time?
I do get asked questions like that. Do I notice more people undergoing Kundalini awakenings or kind of awakening as a world? And I do think that we very much are going through a time of pretty massive deconstruction. So what we once knew and kind of the conditioning that we once were under, kind of the people and structures that tell us who to be, what to be, how to act, a lot of those have crumbled, and we're sort of seeing the after effects of that. And so it is, it's definitely an interesting point in time to be alive. But what I would say is that very much on an individual level, I don't necessarily see more people awakening. I do see more consciousness, or I don't see more people going through Kundalini awakenings necessarily. I see people more consciously aware of some of the conditioning that they're under, or going through some form of spiritual awakening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. In your
Okay.
book, in your book, you talk about the 3 different phases of Kundalini Awakening, and we've really been touching on phase 1 and the different things that happen. How about the second and third phase? What can people expect?
Yeah, so the first phase is that purification fire that we're talking about. So people, describe it as volcanic heat or a freight train of energy for a reason. So in the second phase, it is more of a healing of conditioning. And so you go through kind of working through your own blockages, your own trauma, maybe that of kind of your family, a bit of stuff that has been passed down to you, to considering, how society in the world has really conditioned us through models, basically. We very much look at models of how we are supposed to be, what we are supposed to be, and follow those until we start to kind of become more conscious and recognize, like, oh yeah, I'm following something that doesn't even really make sense. I've just been conditioned to believe that this is true on sort of a larger level. And through phase 2, typically people feel more flow and more connected to their spiritual essence. And then in phase 3, what can happen is a feeling of clear light, an opening of the spiritual heart. And so this whole process is very much going from, if you consider the chakra system from the root chakra all the way up to the crown as being different stops in which we have attained different perspective from this consciousness energy rising up. It's really going from the perspective of being pretty locked in our individual perspective to awakening to greater and greater things within ourselves and within outer reality, until we sort of recognize that everything is us, basically, and learn how to relate to it a bit differently over time.
Well, I know in the second phase you talk about the dark night of the soul. Can you expand on that a little bit for our listeners?
Yeah, I actually just wrote a blog about that, about how my view of that has changed over the years. But in terms of the dark night of the soul, what happens is a couple of things. One is that, again, it's one of those terms in our popular culture where people are going through a period of depression or something dark, and they call it a dark night of the soul. And that wasn't the original intended meaning. It was first coined by St. John of the Cross, who was talking about how you can find light and experience growth in even the darkest of circumstances, and also an experience of going into a really high state of consciousness, like a bliss state or an ecstatic state. And those states tend to only last pretty briefly. And so when you sort of come out of those states, it can sort of feel like you were in a really brightly lit room and then are sort of plunged into darkness. And so the dark night of the soul is very much a time of recalibration, reintegration, and sort of it could be experienced as, anything from experiencing a lot of darkness personally to having these experiences going into like an ecstatic or highly conscious state and then coming out of them and being like, oh, I miss that higher consciousness state.
Well, and it's interesting because as people start to have their Kundalinis awaken, they are going through all these different transformations. What are some of the things that they can expect to see? Because I'm sure the path, and you talk about this in your book, the path, our spiritual path gets a little bit more difficult because we're kind of moving through things.
Yeah, and so really awakening first goes through a cycle of, kind of healing and relating to your own stuff, and then healing and relating to and becoming aware of the conditioning that we're under. In terms of expectations, it really depends where somebody is in the process. Most people who are experiencing Kundalini awakening are very much in the first phase, in that fire purification sort of phase, if they are experiencing a Kundalini awakening. And so in terms of what to expect is that over time, the perspective greatly changes. How you relate to the world and the people in it changes, because what starts to happen is, people call this shadow work and that sort of stuff, but you start to recognize that what is external is what is internal. And so it's sort of like you realize that you've been casting people into roles or putting a lot of projections and stuff of your own unhealed stuff onto people. And you basically start to take that back. And as you do that, you can very much relate to the outer world and the people in it differently and, much more calmly and rationally. And so what happens is not that, you're never going to have difficulties in your life again. You just very much relate to them differently and from a different perspective, from a different place. Everybody doesn't irritate you as they maybe once did, or you can recognize why they are triggering you or upsetting you from looking within.
Yeah, it allows you to see the bigger picture and kind of step back a little bit and not get stuck, because a lot of times people get stuck in these mundane things.
Yeah, exactly. And so that really is awakening to any degree, is starting to sort of question that, is starting to be like, oh, hey, what are my motivations for being? Why am I reacting the way I am? Is how I am reacting, is that me currently, or might I be acting like an infant or a teenager or something like that? Hey, let's look at that sort of thing.
Well, we talked about when people have a spontaneous awakening. What if people are looking to create the awakening? Is there differences in what they can expect?
Yeah, so people who tend to have spontaneous Kundalini awakenings, especially if they don't have a prior framework, like I went through a Kundalini awakening and I started to have experiences of, past lives and stuff like that. And my only experience of past lives were the people on television claiming to be like Cleopatra and stuff like that. So I was really resistant. And so people who are experiencing spontaneous Kundalini awakenings or any sort of spiritual awakening in our world, it's really hard because we have such this culture of people telling other people that the spiritual isn't real and that people are crazy if they have any sort of emotion or spiritual experience. And so there does tend to be a lot more resistance with people who are having spontaneous awakenings until they can get a framework for it, and until they can get skills and sort of, understandings. But even for people that are experiencing a Kundalini awakening that they start themselves, there's still going to be kind of that need for consideration of, all that stuff we just talked about, like how am I relating to the world? How am I relating to other people? And that changing of identity and sort of, becoming a new self, new perspective. There is some difficulty with that, even if you're, a really stable person. And so there very much are joys as well as hardships on any path of awakening. But I would say for people going through spontaneous awakenings, it tends to be harder for them.
Well, it's good to know, and for people to have a resource that they can go to, because, 10, 20 years ago, there wasn't really a lot of discussion about this. And when people were having these awakenings or spontaneous awakenings, like, what do I do with this,
Yeah, exactly. And that is a large reason why I do the work that I do, because a lot of my work is really focused. I tend to be a very pragmatic, person. And so I definitely bring that to the table, is that a lot of my work is focused on discernment, and so even 10 to 20 years ago, or prior to my work, a lot of the work was through psychologists or therapists, and that work definitely has its place. But considering, in the book on Kundalini specifically, I have a section talking about how things like herbs and body work and acupuncture and how all those things can really help people and why during a process like this. And I think that conversation is very much needed in regards to spiritual awakenings, and also people who might be therapists or body workers or, acupuncturists and stuff like that, who are looking to help people going through these experiences as well.
So with all that information, why do you think receiving support in the modern world for spiritual issues can be so difficult?
Because our modern world, the modern Western world, is very much engaged in a split. And so part of what has happened is that we have created intermediaries for spirituality, specifically, the church, sort of the Christianized lens. That's not the only thing affecting it, but it's a pretty easy thing to point out. And so the idea, we have a very physical Newtonian idea of reality, and anything outside of that, anything that can't be measured by machines, so emotions, any sort of spiritual experiences, those are all, we're continually brought up, we're continually conditioned to believe that those things aren't real. If they can't be seen by, machines, that they aren't real, that we shouldn't be experiencing them, that they are in fact, bad or incorrect or pathological to some degree. And so it's really unfortunate because, as a culture, we very much lack emotional intelligence. We don't know what our emotions are good for. We don't know how to skillfully work with them. We don't know, that people are having spiritual experiences that could use a lot of attention or simply different skills and understandings that can be offered from physical medicine or even mental health care.
I think it's so important to have these discussions. In your book, you talk about how diet, lifestyle, and like fasting, how that all impacts, the Kundalini Awakening. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about that with us.
Yeah, so when we digest things, and this is very much a Chinese medicine and energetic view, we're not only digesting this food, we're also digesting our thoughts, our emotions, our experiences. And so considering our diet on an individual level is very much needed for people who are going through spiritual awakenings, because they might have experiences where all of a sudden their system isn't able to take in very much food, or they need to change their diets, or their body is rejecting certain foods. Maybe they become allergic to certain foods. And what happens out there is that we have a lot of ideology, and some of this ideology is helpful. For example, people saying, oh, you shouldn't eat meat, or you should all have this specific diet, or you should all be, eat a caveman diet, or whatever is going on. Those models can be helpful, but really understanding and learning what's good for you on an individual level and what will help your system to thrive is what's most significant for people, whether they're going through a spiritual awakening or not.
Okay, in your book, you also talk about the Body Deva, and I'd love for you to expand on that for our listeners.
Yeah, so that was my last book previous to this one, and the Body Deva is a method of working on an individual level with your body. So the best way that I can explain this is that 5 people might have low back pain, and that might be for 5 very different reasons, actually. But we treat it in our culture as like, oh, all 5 people will have the same exact treatment. But 2 people, it might be physical from, injuries or sports, or, getting off a horse wrong or whatever's going on. Another person might have emotions, and 2 other people might have had, sexual history or assault, or, other emotional or spiritual issues going on in that area. And it's really looking for individual reasons for being and knowing how to communicate with our bodies that we can heal. And we can do so by understanding those individual reasons for being. We really do have so much capacity as individuals. We just tend to lack the skills and know-how to go about really doing things that are truly wonderful for ourselves. And so learning how to work with the consciousness of the body is my Body Deva book, and I do suggest it for people. It really is wonderful. It really is wonderful work, if I do say so myself.
Well, and so, you cover a lot of other things. One of the topics I'd love to talk with you about is when people are using assistance to get to that place of, reawakening or awakening their Kundalini. Sometimes people will look at using like shamanic healing, different herbs. Is there one way that's better than another?
There isn't necessarily one way that is better than another. I will say that I am partial to flotation tanks, so sensory deprivation tanks. I think that they can offer people a tremendous amount of ability to process and to get into really expanded spiritual states. In terms of having assistance like psychedelics and that sort of stuff, I do cover that in the book. And basically my point is that it very much depends on your mentality and how you approach it and your respect level for it as to what you get out of it. Somebody truly looking to commune and work with the teacher's plant that is ayahuasca is going to have a much different experience of it than somebody who is going in looking to have some high or some experience, some peak experience, of things. They're two people that are in very different spots, and they're going to have two very different experiences. They're looking for different things, basically. And so for the first person, something like ayahuasca or some of the other psychedelics can absolutely offer tremendous assistance for people looking to become more conscious. It's just a question of mentality and respect and going along with the diet and researching and all of that sort of stuff.
And of course, ayahuasca is illegal in the U.S., so we would want them to, just look at all the other resources that are available to them before they make that kind of a journey.
Of course, yeah, and that's a big part of my thing is education and not going into experiences blindly, going in with discernment and considering things. People tend to want to approach things, especially spiritual things, with a hammer when sometimes a feather will do. And so, doing something that very much is legal in the United States or elsewhere, receiving body work, going in for therapy with a really good therapist, getting float tanks, acupuncture, all of that sort of stuff can start people on a tremendous healing journey and awakening journey.
Yeah, and there's a lot of shaman. When you look at shamanic healings, that can really help people move to that next level as well.
It can, yeah. I would very much say, and I write about this a lot because that is, what I teach basically, is that shamanic healing very much can have a continuum. And so there needs to be a lot of discernment about if the person that you're going to, what sort of training they have, what sort of experience they have, all of that sort of stuff, because there isn't a standard or really ethics that is written out for people who are going to be shamanic healers like there is for licensed professions. And so there is a little bit more discernment that goes into finding somebody that's really good. But spiritual healing is amazing, and really healing things like ancestry and past lives, or even the time that is, pre-verbal, so in utero and kind of early childhood, that is all stuff that spiritual healing really excels at, and we need a tremendous amount of it, both individually as well as, as a culture at large.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, so Mary, where can people connect with you and learn more about your books and be part of your community?
So they can go to mary-shutan.com, MaryShutan.com. That's all one word. I have a blog that I am trying to write in more frequently, as well as announcements about courses that are offered online. And you can sign up for my workshop. You could sign up for my mailing list. You can also go to my Facebook page, Mary Mueller Shutan, and connect with me there. But your best bet is going to mary-shutan.com and signing up for the mailing list.
And going from there. Well, Mary, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you again, Mary. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you, and of course, to talk about your new book, Working with Kundalini. If you'd like to connect with Mary, you can at her website, mary-shutan.com, for more information, and her books are available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.